Hello and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, thrilled as ever to be joined by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And delighted to be welcoming, making his Spiked podcast debut, Chris Rose.
Hello.
Chris, you're a political commentator and you've got a new YouTube channel as well that people can look out for. So please do that. You'll be able to find the link in the show notes. We've got loads to talk about today. We'll be discussing the fallout from the murder of Henry Nowak, the Peter Mandelson files, and the ban on the pro-Palestine influencers Hasan, Piker and Cenk Uygur. So this time last week, on the day people will be watching this, the killer of Henry Nowak was found guilty. Since then, all kinds of things have emerged. We've seen the body cam footage. The killer has been sentenced for 21 years, life sentence. I think the whole nation is shocked by this, Tom, not simply because of the murder, but because of the way that the police handled the murder at the scene. And on that body cam footage, you see the way they look at Henry Nowak, this 18-year-old dual heritage Polish-British student, is treated with absolute contempt. He is called a racist, and immediately that seems to flip a switch in the police's head where they say they don't believe that he's been stabbed. They believe his murderer, that he was the victim of a crime, a victim of racism. Tom, what have you made of this case?
Well, I think as we've learned more, as we saw the conclusion of the trial, the sentencing remarks, and now this body cam footage, it's quite clear that this wasn't just a tragedy, but an injustice, that this was the culmination of many decades now of supposedly anti-racist policing practices and just a general atmosphere around crime and justice in this country, which created a situation like this, a horrific situation where, as you say, this young man, 18 years old, walking back from a night out, not even particularly inebriated, comes across his killer, Vikram Digwa. A scuffle ensues, an argument ensues. He is stabbed multiple times. And yet, because the perpetrator fabricates this allegation of racism, suggests that he was called a racial slur by Nowak, suggests that he was punched even though there was no proper evidence of that this was essentially just taken as read. I mean, it's fascinating watching that body cam footage, horrific in so many ways, but the fact that there is just so much essentially credulity on the part of the police officers who attended, and such a lack of attention to the man who's lying on the floor saying he can't breathe. There was that particular moment, people will have picked out their own if they have indeed seen the footage, but where you have Henry Nowak repeatedly saying that he's been stabbed, and the police officer says, I don't think you have, mate.
You've been stabbed. You've been stabbed? Whereabouts? I don't think you have, mate.
Oh, I can't breathe.
Put the hand in the cuff, mate. Yeah. At the moment, you are under arrest, and that's for assault, so you do not have to say anything.
And there was a fascinating thing, this came up in the sentencing remarks where, of course, it's easy to, after the fact, suggest that police should have acted in a different way or should have responded in XYZ fashion. And makes a point of saying, the judge that is, that of course they're not always going to believe what a particular person in a particular situation is saying, i.e. people who are about to be arrested might claim to have been hurt, they might claim to be under medical difficulties, but they did in effect believe the other party, the person who had chased Henry Nowak, who had stabbed him. They believed him implicitly, and particularly with this police anti-racism commitment, which has been this document, which was I believe brought into force last year, which talks about the need to treat different communities differently, effectively on the basis of race, which explicitly says that we should have a colourblind approach to criminal justice because that would produce unequal outcomes. It's quite clear that even if that particular document had no bearing on this particular case, that general atmosphere that has existed pretty much since the Macpherson report back in the late 1990s, that essentially allegations of racism must be taken as holy and that policing practice should flow from that, has created all kinds of horrors. And I think this is just the most visceral, extreme case that the public have ever had put before their noses. But as I say, a long time in the coming in many ways.
Yeah, and Chris, this has rightly raised the spectre of two-tier policing. That debate is now in full flow again. How could it be that so many people simply deny that this is a problem in the UK?
I know, I'm absolutely flabbergasted that people still deny it, even though we've had plenty of proof over the years. You know, this is going back to the two-tier policing we saw with pro-Palestine supporters. When they do something that's, you know, fuggery behaviour or something that's socially unacceptable. The police are more likely to treat them with more leniency, whereas they have a St. George's flag waver. They're, more likely to be more robust in their approach. They pin them down. They saw them with the batons. We've all seen it there. So it doesn't really surprise us. But now we've seen what's happened with Henry Nowak, and it's the outcome of the overreach of race equality that people like me were trying to warn about during the George Floyd protests. And, people from my own community said, oh, he's just a sellout. But I don't really mind if they want to give me abuse for all that, because I knew that this would lead to something that's created an atmosphere where police think, okay, this guy is not giving any proof about racism, but we're just going to take his accusation and we're just going to take their word for it and prioritize it over an 18-year-old boy who's actually dying in front of them. And we can see from the photo that when they're handcuffing him and putting the reading him his rights, they're actually saying it, and he's actually, his hand's actually quite pale. You can actually see him dying right in front of them, but they're just reading him his rights and treating him like a criminal instead of treating him like a victim, because that's what he was. And I'm, with the reactions to it, I think they've gone quite too much one way, because what someone like Nigel Farage has said, I think he was bang on to call it out for what it was. It is anti-white bias. I think some people are too afraid to call that out because they think it has, connotations to the far right, but it's not. It's quite factual.
Yeah.
And, as a black person, I have no issue calling it out, because he died because he was treated like a criminal, because they thought there's a white guy, so there's a good chance he was actually racist, and there's a ethnic minority. And there was actually a crowd of people around. I think they were his family or friends, and they would have made the phone call as well. So we don't really know everything just yet, but we can conclude that he wasn't just the only person that was there. And we need to know more about it, because, he just isn't really right. And as I was saying about Nigel Farage as well, he has mentioned anti-white racism. I think that's bang on. And seeing Keir Starmer and other politicians in the House of Commons yesterday banging on about his tone and saying that he was ripping up hysteria, I think that's absolutely wrong, because what he said was actually correct in my view. He's not whipping it up. When I looked at the body cam footage, I was actually in cold rage when I heard him say, I don't think you have, mate. Now, Nigel Farage's reaction would make no difference to me. He just articulated what I was already feeling. With the protesters in Southampton, it would have made no difference. People were already angry, and they wanted to voice their opinion in the best way they know how. So I do think, more people, particularly more people in Parliament, particularly more people in the wider public, we need to make our voices more clear that we do want to roll back on two-tier police. We want to roll back on the equality things that they're pushing, because I don't think it's right to have courses where they certainly say to people, your white privilege is a dangerous thing, and they roll back on it and say, well, you guys should be taught that your white history is bad, and you need to learn about black and Asian history. I think we need to completely roll back on that, because it's creating an atmosphere of fear where they think to themselves, I need to condition myself to think this way, otherwise they may not, promote me, or they may think, oh, he's got a red mark against his name in the policing, and look at the outcome of it.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk a bit more about Nigel Farage's comments and the reaction to it. I mean, it has been pretty extraordinary the way the political class has leapt on that to make Farage the villain of the piece, to move the story on away from this outrageous injustice to essentially a kind of tone policing, and telling people to shut up, basically. You're not allowed to talk about this two-tier policing stuff. Starmer said explicitly that he doesn't believe it exists, even though, the case is right there in front of his eyes.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, if you were reading the newspapers, particularly towards the end of this week, you would have thought that the great crime, the great scandal here was that Nigel Farage talked of pure cold rage, or that he said that white lives matter as much as black lives, or that he said that two-tier policing was a big problem and it was generating precisely the kind of anger that we saw in the streets of Southampton over the course of this week. I'm really bored and sick and enraged by the fact that we end up having a conversation about language and rhetoric.
Yeah.
when what we should be talking about is the violence, or what we should be talking about is the injustice, what we should be talking about is the double standards. And when you have Keir Starmer or anyone else engaging in this kind of tone policing or calls to not politicise this tragedy, what do not politicise this tragedy now means, in effect, is shut up. I mean, that is absolutely clear. And this is not to excuse the, again, horrific, mindless violence that you can sometimes see emerge on the streets at times like this, to recognise that if you refuse to talk about a certain issue, if you claim that even a perspective is completely illegitimate to express, then you are creating a sort of more tinderbox-like atmosphere. People have no outlet in which for these things to be discussed, let alone to be actually remedied. Of course, there's been some unedifying exchanges back and forth, Reform putting out quotes suggesting that Kemi Badenoch, who has obviously been pretty critical of Nigel Farage, claiming that he's engaging in a kind of level of rabble-rousing by talking about rage when we should be talking about courage and so on and so forth. Reform putting out quotes of making it seem as if she says, I don't care about White Lives Matter, when obviously her full quote also says she doesn't care about Black Lives Matter either. That has been unedifying, but at the same time, the core issue surely is what happened on that night. The core issue surely is the decades now of policy, practice, atmosphere, which has created a situation like this, and the fact that official anti-racism has become a deadly business. I mean, we know that in this particular case, if you look at the pathologist's report, it seems like Henry Nowak was stabbed in such a way that it wouldn't matter how quick the emergency services got to him, his life tragically couldn't have been saved. But there are so many other cases now in which this voice that everyone in public life now has to have in their head about racism, about that as any kind of whiff of it, real, perceived, malicious, invented, has to guide their decision making, has led to so many tragedies now, whether we're talking about Southport and the failure to intervene to stop Axel Ruda-Cabana from doing what he did, again, over perceived fears that they'd be racially profiling a black boy with a knife, whether that we're talking about, again, cases like Valdo Calacane, the very, very mentally ill young man, paranoid schizophrenic, who killed 3 people in Nottingham. And again, he wasn't part of the reason that he wasn't dealt with as robustly, shall we say, by social services and by psychiatric care and so on, is because there was at certain points a concern about having too many black people in that form of custody. So official anti-racism, it might not have killed in this case, but it has in many others, and certainly led to a situation in which the victim of a crime was treated as the potential perpetrator. Why don't we talk about that rather than about what is the right form of words in this particular instance? And I think it's because they don't want us to talk about it at all. That seems to me the upshot of all of this discussion.
And you can kind of see that in the way that the comparison that a lot of people have made, and I think it's a valid one here, certainly in terms of talking about the reaction, is saying you're not allowed to politicise Henry Nowak's death, but George Floyd's death 4,000 miles ago not only should be politicised, but should be the basis of actually reforming and structurally overturning every institution, from the police right down to your local library or whatever it might be. People see the hypocrisy there, surely.
Absolutely, because there are old quotes from Keir Starmer where he says George Floyd should be used as a catalyst for change here, even though it has nothing to do with Britain. He wanted to bring forward change in the UK. And I like to think to myself, if the situation where the races were reversed and it was a white guy who stabbed, let's say, a black guy who was innocent, didn't do anything, and he then called the police and said, this black guy is a thief, just to set out a negative stereotype, and he was pinned down, handcuffed, and died in police in their arms. Do you think Keir Starmer would turn around and say, actually, can we not talk about this? Can we not politicise this? Of course not. From day one, he would be straight on it. He would be calling it out. He would be blaming the Tories and Reform for their rhetoric, saying they've increased racism. He'd want to move forward with more anti-racist stuff just to push forward. He would not be saying to themselves, oh, but the family said, can you not talk about this? So can you not, speak about it? You're being divisive to anyone. He would never say that to any black civil rights activists at all. He wouldn't say that to his own MPs. He wouldn't say it to Green MPs either. But this just shows the two-tiered nature of Keir Starmer, because it does seem as though when the victim is white, he's a lot slower to even say their name. Because it's not the first time. If we look at other people who have died, who had been probably stabbed by illegal migrants or, possibly sexually assaulted by them as well. And the victim's white, he doesn't say a word about them. And we can see that with Henry Nowak as well, because he hasn't said Wayne Broadhouse's name. He hasn't said Rihanna's name. When it's convenient, like with the trans girl who was murdered a couple of years ago, he was quick to say her name in Parliament, and he also met with the mother of the person. But this time it's a lot slower. He has to be forced to mention Henry Nowak's name and give a statement by the speaker. So it naturally doesn't come to him to say, oh, let me just do the decent thing. And this is the thing, because we can't really have one rule for someone who's died who's black and someone who's died who's white. For me personally, I think we need to see it as the same thing. And so that's why I'm very supportive of any body who wants to go forward and roll back on DEI training in the police force, because this type of mentality is causing not just issues, but in this case, a death. They say, oh, don't politicize it, but actually Olivia, the sister, actually reposted a clip of Robert Jenrick's speech where he asked Shabana, do white lives matter as much as black lives? So it clearly shows that they want answers as well. I don't particularly think Nigel Farage has exploited it at all. I think he's done the correct approach that I personally want to see, because if this was 2020, probably a softer approach would have been possible, but things have possibly declined so much in 2026 that we need to see a more robust approach to this. That's why I think the response is more on the ball, more what I want to see. I think other responses have been a bit more flirted around the issue too much and not really just going straight on it.
Absolutely. Shall we talk about Pete Mandelson? The Mandelson files, or some of them, have come out this week. 1,500 pages of documents relating to Peter Mandelson's exchanges with various government ministers. I mean, it's a bit of a strange one in the sense that there isn't much mention of Jeffrey Epstein, which is supposed to be the reason why Peter Mandelson was sacked, because the Prime Minister was shocked to learn what everyone already knew, that Mandelson had connections with Epstein that he might have downplayed in some way. But the messages do make for interesting reading, because they essentially paint a picture of what we kind of knew from the outside, which this government is totally dysfunctional.
Yes, absolutely. And that was one thing going into this, which after the humble address motion was passed and they were compelled to hand over all this information, it became clear quite quickly that anything which might be of particular interest to the Mandelson-Epstein scandal and the obviously ongoing case was just not going to be in there. I mean, the Metropolitan Police had already requested that the security vetting documents would not be included. Similarly, the Intelligence and Security Committee insisted that anything that might be prejudicial to any of the ongoing legal processes wouldn't be included. So what we've ended up with is a lot of comments which are prejudicial or certainly demeaning of various cabinet ministers talking about each other. You get a clear sense that Peter Mandelson didn't think very much of Keir Starmer, saying he lacks verve, which I think is quite a polite way of putting it in many respects.
It's a very Mandelson way of putting it, isn't it?
Very Mandelson way of putting it. Yeah, exactly. It's both catty and restrained at the same time. But also, Wes Streeting is in the grips of a early midlife crisis was another lot. I think in relation to comments he'd made about Palestine, and one of the ones, of course, that's been most damning is done the rounds is an exchange between Pat McFadden, I believe was then in the Cabinet Office, and Mandelson talking about his discussions with Labour MPs and how every time it just boils down to them asking how can we tax people more so that we can give benefits to others. So have we learnt much? Not really. Have we got some new, quite spicy, embarrassing lines to throw back at this government? Absolutely. A cynic might think that maybe the opposition realised this might be the case. At the very least, they would be handled a fair amount of Tinder and not much substance. But yes, another reminder of just how riddled with infighting and bitchiness this Labour government is to layer on top of all the other much more substantively wrong things that it is doing.
I mean, I suppose the good side is that there are some people in the Labour government who are just as aware of how awful it is as the rest of us are.
I mean, hopefully now, because obviously that's what struck me the most, the text from Pat McFadden. It kind of just revealed what we already knew about Labour, that they want to just tax as much as possible so we can give to people who wake up at 12 o'clock midday and spend all their money on, God knows what. But it just kind of shows what's the point of working hard, waking up early, trying to get a promotion or set up a business to actually give something back to the economy if they're thinking, well, we're just going to tax you even more. I mean, that's not rewarding. I don't really think to myself, let me motivate myself just to give more money to a family on benefits so they can have a holiday that I can't, And, there are other things as well, which Thomas mentioned, it's in the files as well. In a way, it's not anything that's as spicy as I was hoping it would be.
Yeah.
I think then what they are just more attack lines that the oppositions definitely can use, because, the Pat McFadden's text is definitely something you want to see on leaflets from the Tories and Reform. That would be out a lot, because that's just, I think it summed up the Labour Party very well, pretty much. I mean, that's just the party of benefits, not the party of workers.
Yeah, and it kind of sums up the only thing that kind of binds together like quite disparate factions of the Labour Party is that they're all in favour of welfare and wouldn't dream of making any cuts to welfare, no matter how long, no matter how many young people, for instance, are languishing on welfare. I mean, it's Peter Mandelson was also, even before this, we knew that Peter Mandelson was famously scathing about Labour's lack of strategy for growth, and there's a bit more in these messages that comes out about that. People may have seen this interesting thing. The Labour Growth Group has essentially disbanded recently because there's not enough interest from Labour MPs. And I think one of them admitted that it was basically they realised that because the government was saying the word growth a lot, they thought it would advance their careers to be seen as being a member of the growth group. So that's why if people are wondering why Labour MPs aren't pushing for growth maximising measures, that might be why.
Another sort of subtext to a lot of these messages is the sense that some people, at least at the top of the Labour Party, sort of do recognise where they're going wrong, but they are just in hock to those backbenchers. They do recognise that growth, surprise, surprise, is an important thing to pursue, particularly in the economic circumstances that we find ourselves in. They do recognise that it is both fiscally unsustainable and also just electoral kryptonite to continue with this completely unleashed welfarism, which is, it just fuels a sense of injustice as much as anything else amongst people who are really trying to work hard in very difficult circumstances. But because they are essentially over a barrel and trapped by the sections of the Labour Party who just think in terms of what would a quote-unquote good person do in this situation. I got into the Labour Party to help people, and that's about as far as that ideology goes. They haven't really thought about any of what might flow from that, what decisions, what might to be made, what a policy would look like. That's become crystal clear in the midst of all of this. But yes, I mean, at the very least, it reminds you in terms of how rubbish this government is, many people inside government are more in touch with the public than we might realise. They see it as well as we do. They're just required to pretend otherwise in public.
Absolutely. Shall we talk about the banning of two pro-Palestine influencers? So the Young Turks, Cenk Uygur, and the live streamer Hasan Piker were told that they were not allowed to come to the UK to address the South by Southwest festival. Among other things, Cenk was due to be on Piers Morgan's show. Hasan Piker was due to address the Oxford Union. So if you're fans of them, then there's a lot that you might have missed out on. Tom, I mean, this is becoming a depressingly regular occurrence where essentially anyone slightly spicy from outside the UK, and I'm including a lot of people who are spicier than these guys, are just now have their visa waiver revoked. We just don't want to hear from them. The Home Secretary just says no. I mean, it ranges from, people who wanted to attend the Tommy Robinson protest to Kanye West. Even that's just now the default position of whenever there's a foreign person wants to come and speak in the UK and we don't like their views, then you're off, you're cancelled.
Exactly. And I think the leftists who cheered or demanded some of those earlier cancellations of visas, whether it's people who are being flown in to address the Unite the Kingdom marches, whether it was Kanye West to a certain extent, although that was a whole enormous case of itself, I suppose. There was always going to be this kind of equal and opposite reaction. I think the government, for almost PR purposes, felt duty-bound to demonstrate some semblance of balance in terms of how it was that they were cracking down on people who were coming over to the UK to to address the public over here. And again, it's not to say that these individuals don't have unsavory views. I don't know a hell of a lot about Cenk Uygur, but I know that Hasan Piker is this sort of, in some respects, quite absurd character, but also, you know, when it comes to his views on Israel-Palestine and his willingness, shall we say, to make excuses for groups like Hamas, or to say things which sound pretty praiseworthy of Hamas or the Houthis, or to sort of, relish in that sort of Islamist chic, even if he's not necessarily articulating that precisely himself. I mean, this is scummy, to put it lightly. But what's probably clear in this case and in any others is that, particularly in this day and age, if you stop these people from coming, it has basically zero effect on public opinion. Anyone who is a fan of either of these two gentlemen can watch hours upon hours upon hours of their stuff anyway. They could easily just be beamed in to the conference in which they were otherwise banned from addressing, or certainly to another one. It's just gesture politics. What it does do, though, is allow them to have at least 24 hours or maybe even a week of parading around as the victims of censorship. Because they have been, in one way, shape or form. Now, of course, a country is allowed to decide who can and cannot enter. Neither of them are citizens of this country. There are, around the edges, decisions that need to be made. But it's so clear to me here that the point of this was essentially authoritarian gesture politics, and it's backfired spectacularly.
And, you know, one of the worst ways in which it's backfired is, of course, both of them have blamed Israel for the censorship. They've said that this is a case in point of how Israel controls the British government. Which is obviously completely crackers. As we know, the Labour government doesn't get on with Israel. Shabana Mahmood is pro-Palestine. She's the one, as the Home Secretary, she's the one that ultimately made the decision. It seems to be the only time we're able to close the border is when a sort of annoying influencer tries to get into the country.
I know, it's like we should probably just spread a line and say, like, all these illegal migrants have posted something, a line that they don't like, and they'll quickly shut it. But no, I'm certainly, I mean, the two people you mentioned, I'm certainly no fan of them. I find them very irritating and quite extreme, to be honest, but I wouldn't go as far as banning them. But I do think people on the left should have had the consistency of saying, you know, these people from the Unite the March rally should be allowed to come as well.
Yeah.
But obviously some of them have cheered it on, and then a week later they said, oh no, people we like have been banned now. Free speech is on the threat all of a sudden. And, you know, it's not the first time. I remember years ago when, was it Talk Radio at the time, was banned from YouTube. And a lot of people said, oh, that's so funny. And then a few months later, the Novara Media was banned from YouTube. And all of a sudden, free speech is on the threat again. Yeah. But they really just saw it then. It is inconsistent. We ban people like that, and then we put that Egyptian fella who Keir Starmer was delighted to welcome back to the UK. I mean, his views were more extreme than most of the people we've banned. So it doesn't really make any sense. It's not consistent. It's just, as you say, just the politics. That doesn't really make any difference because they can just view online, as you say. But if we are going to ban people, at least let it be people who actually advocate violence, not people who are just coming out with something a bit spicy. You know, we're all adults, we're not children. We can view things we don't like. And to be honest with you, if I was to go to an Oxford debate, I would love to see people who have actually stronger differing views. Like, you know, I could see one of the people who've been banned versus Tommy Robinson. I'd be more up for seeing that instead of people who only differ just a little bit. That's more interesting to me.
Yeah, we want real disagreement, not just, you know, the rest is politics style fake.
Exactly, a Tory versus Labour that differ very minorly.
Yeah. Owen Jones has said that the censorship of pro-Palestine activists, or as he calls them, anti-genocide campaigners, is the worst censorship in human history, I think, since the Second World War, which shows he hasn't really been following much of the free speech debate that's been going on.
Quite.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to everyone at home. No Spike podcast unlocked this week, but we do have an extra special treat, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much for watching the Spike podcast. We'll be back next week, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the Spike podcast, then why not check out what else our channel has to offer, from our documentaries to our weekly interviews and podcasts like The Brendan O'Neill Show. And if you're a Spike supporter, you can watch the second half of this episode by logging in on the Spike website. If you're not yet a Spike supporter, then why not sign up now? You'll get unlimited access to the website, ad-free reading, discounted tickets to our events, and so much more. So Become a Spiked supporter today by going to spiked-online.com/support. That's spiked-online.com/support.